Okay, so today I wanted to talk about wellness, specifically the cult of wellness. I'm going to call it a cult to be provocative, but the cult of wellness surrounding Andrew Huberman. But first, let me kind of explain some of the backstory. So last week I was reading this article, the cover story of New York Mag, called Andrew Huberman's Mechanisms of Control. I was a little bit disappointed by the piece, and it just felt like a missed opportunity. I mean, if you haven't read the article, you can find it on New York Mag. I guess this might be a spoiler, but it's mostly about how shitty of a boyfriend he is. And we can talk about kind of like, whether we can separate the culture from the culture creator in this situation. But there are so many things you can critique about the like bro-y wellness cult that has come to exist in the wake of like Huberman and his contemporaries' popularity. And that's what I think the article should have been about, and that's what this video is going to be about. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name's Mackenzie. This is my channel, Think Too Much. Let's get into it. So this video is going to be kind of broken up into a couple of parts, but I guess like first and foremost, I'm going to be talking about a little bit of the history of wellness, because I think Andrew Huberman's kind of existence in the space is a bit of a new phenomenon, and it's an industry that has for the last several years, maybe decade or so, I think has been pretty feminized. I want to explain why Andrew Huberman's kind of prescriptions and why his brand is so persuasive and how that might make it a little bit dangerous. And then lastly, I guess I'm just going to talk about like how I think people should engage with a Huberman-esque wellness space, and like how to kind of take the content and like glean it for the value it might offer, but also maintain a skepticism and like a critical eye toward the prescriptions that a Huberman-like person might offer. So a good amount of research did go into this video. So there's kind of like, I guess, a level of like authority that I might be speaking with because of said research, but I also want to preface this with, these are my opinions formed on the basis of this research. I'm gonna list the articles that I referenced for this video below. If you wanna read and like verify the information, please be my guest. I guess in the interest of stating my standpoint out the gate, I'm someone who comes from a humanities background. I got my master's at the New School for Social Research, and I studied liberal studies, but I specifically emphasized in gender and sexuality studies. So that's kind of the angle that I'm coming at this with, or at least that's kind of where I began my inspection of the Huberman stratosphere. So if you don't know who Andrew Huberman is, he is a neuroscientist and a professor at Stanford University. And he has a podcast called Huberman Lab, which kind of explores various facets of like health and wellness. And I think maybe some of the appeal of his brand is kind of centered on, he's like offering prescriptions that he like ostensibly uses. So he suggests what appears from the outside to be like kind of a very strict lifestyle, kind of with a focus and emphasis on like health and wellness. And he uses kind of science to back it up, but also like personal experience. Like he does kind of a lot of the things that he prescribes for people. And I should also say, I have not listened to all of his podcasts. I have listened to some of his podcasts, and I've kind of observed the culture surrounding him, but I am by no means like an expert on the Huberman Lab podcast, which is why this video is not necessarily about Andrew Huberman per se, it's more so about kind of the shift in the wellness culture that he represents and he is a part of. Him being a doctor and professor at Stanford University are two pretty important components of his brand. That's his claim to authority in the claims that he makes or in the prescriptions that he provides. The podcast itself invokes a lot of scientific theory, scientific terms, and scientific like speak in order to kind of help him provide evidence and context for the things that he is explaining or the things that he is prescribing. I should also mention that the podcast does include advertisements, and those advertisements can be things like AG Greens, which is like supposed to be a vitamin supplement, and things of that sort. Okay, so important context for the arguments that I'm going to be making in this video is the history of wellness, right? So there are various claims to where wellness itself started. I'm less interested in those. I think maybe the most relevant of kind of histories that we can invoke was the kind of like hippie movement of wellness in the 60s and 70s. And I think it's important to note that the hippie movement for wellness was one that was pretty anti-establishment, and it was one that was very skeptical of like the medical industrial complex. Now, I I say that because the version of wellness that I grew up with in like the 2010s was kind of like a Goopified version of wellness. Goop is like a woman's wellness brand, essentially. And it's kind of critical to note that like Goop was very much targeted at women, and women were susceptible to the messaging of a Goop because women just have had experiences within the medical industrial complex in which they do feel left behind. The messaging was meant to target a group of people who the medical industry was not built by or for. So I think it's interesting to kind of recognize how wellness came to be a bit more feminized because it had this history that was imbued with so much anti-establishment sentiment. And so, come 2008, 2009, 2010, like 2008 was when Goop was founded, the people who are more likely to buy into that messaging are women because women have just firsthand experienced being left behind by the medical industrial complex. And that can be explained just by patriarchy, right? And kind of the history of science and education and research. It was an industry that was built when women had fewer rights and less access. So it was kind of built by and for men, like the structures built by and for men, because it was built at a time when women were considered like inferior subjects, whatever. So just like those structures have created like a contemporary landscape in which women are less likely to be involved in clinical trials, women are less likely to be the ones like running the experiments, leading up the research, et cetera, et cetera. And luckily that's changing, but that sort of stuff doesn't change overnight. So you kind of have a lot of women who have this like bad taste in their mouth from their experience with doctors who gaslight them, who don't actually understand the problems that they're experiencing. I'm thinking of like specifically women's healthcare. I mean, anyone who's been on birth control can understand how unpleasant the experience of birth control can be. And notably, men can't relate to that. You can make a whole other video about the issues with like women's healthcare in America. But all of this is to say that women with good reason kind of turn a skeptical eye towards the medical industrial complex, making them particularly susceptible to the messaging of a wellness culture because wellness was kind of ushered in by anti-establishment hippies. Now, what I think is interesting is comparing a Goop with Andrew Huberman's brand, because there are ways in which they are very similar and there are ways in which they are very different. Now, on this topic, the topic of science and this like anti-establishment sentiment, they are very different because Goop appeals to women broadly and kind of created an era of wellness that was targeted at women and was looking at alternative methods of wellness and health, whereas Andrew Huberman invokes science a ton to kind of justify his prescriptions for wellness. And I would argue that I think that is what kind of helps usher in a large swath of male consumers into the wellness industry. So it's kind of interesting as a woman who's kind of used to being sold the message of like, you will be perfect as soon as you buy this thing that'll make you better, more well, watching the branding of the industry kind of shift and like morph to appeal to men and telling them that they will be able to optimize themselves better once they just buy this thing, once they, consume AG greens. I think another layer to the kind of new era of wellness that Andrew Huberman represents that is of interest is definitely on this science bit. Like, I think this science bit is an important thing to dig into, and I think it's worthy of questioning whether the invocation of science for various like wellness claims and prescriptions is more pernicious than the kind of goopified version we had before. And I'm not sure that it is, but I do want to explain why the invocation of science and the way that Andrew Huberman goes about it would be particularly persuasive to large swaths of people, because I think it's entirely born out of the way our society is structured. So I guess in order to explain that, I want to go on a little bit of like a nerdy rant about American pragmatism, I guess, as described by Charles Peirce. This was actually something that I studied in grad school. The main concepts that are relevant here are Peirce's explanation of like how people come to have fixed beliefs. So basically, Peirce makes the argument that psychologically, not knowing is an uncomfortable experience, which leads people to want to decide on what they believe. And there are 4 different methods of deciding what to believe. And the only ones that are really relevant for this conversation are the method of authority and the method of science. So basically what you need to know about these concepts is this. So Peirce explains that when societies come to decide on a shared set of beliefs via the method of science, the reason it's the most effective is because the method of science basically requires experimentation to validate the results that lead to the belief. So for example, something like gravity. If I am like like, well, I don't believe in gravity, someone can drop an apple out of a window and be like, well, that explains gravity. Here is like the experiment that proves that gravity exists on this planet. So because it's replicable, a larger group of people can get behind it and it's not as easily thrown into question. And then the method of authority is essentially a society coming to agree upon a specific set of beliefs on the basis of basically a governing entity or like a all-powerful entity deciding for them. So you come to decide on a belief because you were told that you're not really allowed to believe otherwise. And these two concepts are at play kind of in our understanding of how Huberman operates, because I think he invokes both. And what I mean by that is that he invokes science, but we are not replicating the experiments that he's referring to in order to verify his claims, right? We are trusting that he is offering prescriptions and making claims on the basis of like a solid foundation of scientific theory, methodology, etc. But we have that faith in him because of the method of authority, because he is a doctor. He has the name doctor at the start of his name, meaning that our governing entities recognize him as an expert in the field, and we trust those entities, more or less because they tell us to trust them. And this is like an oversimplification of like how the world works, but I guess for the purposes of this conversation, I think it's relevant. And this is an important thing to notice, and it's important because it is part of what makes his argument so persuasive for so many people, because the way that he structures his argument is kind of a microcosmic example of kind of the way we've structured our society. I would argue that our society is kind of built on this like method of science and method of authority in fixing a set of beliefs that create our culture and society, like in America, for example, but probably even the Western world, honestly. And honestly, I don't even think that's my claim. I'm pretty sure that is Dick Bernstein's claim, my professor of American pragmatism at NSSR, may he rest in peace. Anyway, it's important because it kind of highlights why people can so easily be persuaded by a Huberman. It's like he's got the doctor title in front of his name, and he's got the kind of institutional backing of Stanford University, which is a school recognized for its academic authority on various subject matters. I personally also think the comparison of Goop and like Huberman's brands of wellness, I find it interesting because I think that they sell products with the same messaging, but I think that they brand it very differently. And I think that the way that they respectively brand their message highlights like certain gender dynamics. So I think where Goop is obviously targeted at women, and it targets women kind of with the messaging of like, buy this thing so you can finally be perfect, so you can like realize your perfect self. And it grafts like very nicely onto like the beauty industry, the diet industry, yada, yada, yada. Huberman, I would argue, makes the same claim and kind of is selling the same idea, only his cohort brands it as like self-optimization, which is another thing that I think makes it more appealing to men, potentially more appealing to the masses. But yeah, this idea of like optimizing the self does feel a bit masculinized to me. And the reason I think that is because I think it kind of borrows from our Western narrative of kind of man conquering nature, man ascending the self, man actualizing. And I think that that narrative is one that has always, you know, most likely intentionally left out women. I will try to explain this briefly, but basically modern philosophy is kind of built on this idea of consciousness. And that kind of easily translated to consciousness as a means of overcoming the self, overcoming the body, overcoming nature as a means of justifying perceived superiority of like the human race. And I think a lot of our current world is built on that idea. And it's an idea that, you know, most likely intentionally leaves out women. And the reason it leaves out women is because women are bound to their bodies in a way that men aren't. When I say women, I mean like biologically sexed women. They are bound to their bodies in that like in order to continue the human race, women need to give birth to babies. And we haven't yet figured out a way to sustainably create babies in a lab, which means that women play an important role in that they literally produce life. And they do so by the natural processes of biology. So this kind of concept of overcoming the self, overcoming the body, overcoming the nature, I think is totally appealing to women because women are raised in a world where like that has kind of dictated our like shared values and like shared understanding of like what goodness is. But in a a way, women are kind of left out of that pursuit because they can never fully overcome the body. And before you had something like contraception or abortion, they were even more vulnerable to the whims of their physical body. Okay, so we've established that like the idea of optimizing the self is male coded in that it kind of draws from Western ideals of progress, but specifically Western ideals of progress that women are left out of. And it also might be an important thing to highlight in kind of understanding the extent of the persuasiveness and the potential perniciousness of Andrew Huberman's cohorts kind of branding and messaging, right? Because it's male coded, we collectively take it more seriously because we were brought up in a patriarchal world that just kind of assumes the male way of doing things is best, which might make people more vulnerable to its prescriptions and the insecurity that comes from the inability to properly optimize the self. And that's where Andrew Huberman, his persona, comes in. And I think that's what the author is kind of trying to criticize, that it's like, oh look, this guy who purports to be so in control of himself, in control of his body, of his whims, of his nature, his desires, it turns out he actually isn't all that controlled in all areas of his life. I think the author would have been better off explaining why Andrew Huberman's like brand and messaging is as persuasive as it is and how it might encourage an unearned sense of trust. Honestly, like I think if you're an author and you're trying to dissuade the masses from blindly following and trusting in Andrew Huberman, I don't know that, explaining why he's a shitty boyfriend is the way to do that. I think a better method is to just explain to people why his messaging is so persuasive, why it feels like you can trust him, and to kind of cast doubt on your ability to blindly trust this guy, because that's really what it comes down to when it comes to consuming this like new wave of wellness content. It's going to seem really legit, and that's not to say that you have to disengage with it altogether. I don't think it's true that like all of Andrew Huberman's prescriptions are bad things to try. And in fact, the author even mentions kind of using one of the breathing techniques that he explains on his podcast. I think it's just, genuinely, I think it's just a matter of taking it for what it is when you hear the podcast. When I heard the podcast for the first time, I think it was probably that dopamine one that caused like fucking dopamine fasting to become a thing. I remember him talking about like going to the gym without listening to music, and I was like, damn, this man lives one sad life. Like I have no interest in going to the gym and not listening to music. I think there are all sorts of arguments to be made that it's not worth it, but honestly, those don't even matter because like personally, I guess I am confident and comfortable enough in my like health and wellness routine that I wasn't susceptible or vulnerable to the messaging of an Andrew Huberman that's telling me that I'm not fasting on dopamine enough. And that's why I feel bad about myself. Does that make sense? So it's like, I just think it's important to kind of warn people that like this messaging is pretty much designed to latch on to your insecurities about either not being a perfectly optimized self or not being the perfect ideal version of yourself, whether you're not skinny enough, whether you're not strong enough, whether you're not willful enough, determined enough, etc., etc. The messaging is kind of meant to sell you him and his product by leeching onto that insecurity that they know that a lot of people have. So I guess the thing that I do and that I recommend others do is that when you engage with this content, regard it with the same level of skepticism you would like a beauty ad. Because they're largely the same thing. They are manipulating your sense of not enoughness and your insecurity in order to push a product on you. And that product is never going to make you feel like enough. So don't get swept up in the false promise that it is. Whew, that was a doozy. Okay. That is genuinely, that's not all I have to say, but it's all I'm going to say about this for now. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed this video. The channel is called Think Too Much because I like to think a lot. So I post videos like this and also vlogs and other videos just kind of meditating on what life is like in your 20s, what life is like in general, all that good stuff. Thank you so much for watching. I will catch you in the next one.